The first people to walk these mountains gave certain places names that outsiders never fully understood. They weren't the tallest peaks, they weren't the easiest places to reach, yet generation after generation they remained fixed in Cherokee memory for reasons that had nothing to do with the view from the summit. Long before the Great Smoky Mountains became a national park, before survey crews mapped the ridges, and long before botanists began arguing over why these strange places existed, Cherokee families were already passing down stories about the mountain balds, the open summits where the forest suddenly gives way to grass. According to the account preserved in the source we're examining today, those places were never treated as ordinary landscapes. They were remembered as locations where old rules applied, where certain paths were avoided after sunset, and where the open ground itself served a purpose that later generations gradually forgot. What makes that tradition remarkable is that it begins with a mystery that still exists today. Researchers have spent decades trying to explain why these grassy summits remain open while the forests surrounding them continue to grow. Different explanations have been proposed, yet the question has never completely disappeared. The elder whose account we're following believed the reason was never hidden in the grass or the soil. He believed people had been looking in the wrong place all along. According to his family's tradition, the balds remained open because they marked something beneath the mountains that his ancestors believed should never be forgotten. They weren't watching the horizon, they were watching the ground. Whether that explanation belongs to history, oral tradition, or something in between is exactly what we're going to examine. We'll begin with the mountain balds themselves, then follow the Cherokee traditions surrounding them, and finally compare those traditions with the historical records and geological questions that still remain unanswered. By the end of this investigation, the mystery may not be solved, but you'll understand why these quiet mountaintops have inspired stories that have survived for generations. When Europeans first entered the southern Appalachian Mountains, they found a landscape unlike anything they had seen farther east. Ridge after ridge disappeared beneath an almost unbroken canopy of hardwood forest. In many places, a person could walk for days without ever leaving the shade of the trees. That was the natural character of the Smokies, and for anyone seeing them for the first time, it seemed as though the forest covered everything, but it didn't. Every so often, high above the valleys, the forest simply ended. The trees gave way to broad, grassy summits that looked completely out of place among the surrounding ridges. Early explorers wrote about them. Surveyors marked them on their maps. Later generations gave them names like Gregory Bald, Andrews Bald, and Rocky Bald, but naming them never answered the question that kept returning every time someone stood on one of those open summits. Why was it there? The question sounds simple until you realize how unusual these places really are. A forest is not a fragile thing. Left alone, it spreads wherever the conditions allow. Seedlings take root, young trees replace old ones, and over time the landscape slowly closes itself. That process has shaped these mountains for thousands of years, yet scattered across the highest ridges are open meadows that refuse to disappear. According to the source we're examining, researchers have proposed several explanations over the past 2 centuries, including ancient grazing animals, long-forgotten fires, and changes in climate. Each theory explains part of the picture, but none has completely explained why the balds remain open while the surrounding forest continues to grow. For most visitors, that mystery ends with science. They accept that the answer is still being debated and continue their hike. The Cherokee approached the same mountains very differently. According to the elder's account preserved in the source, his family never spoke about the balds as geological curiosities. They spoke about them as places with responsibilities. Certain summits carried traditions that were passed from one generation to the next. Hunters were taught that some of these open ridges were not places to spend the night. Children were warned not to wander near the edge of the tree line after sunset. Those customs were remembered long after many people had forgotten where they began. The elder believed they survived because they served a purpose his ancestors considered too important to abandon. What makes that tradition interesting is not that it offers another explanation for the balds, it asks an entirely different question. Modern researchers have generally asked how these grassy summits formed. The elder asked why they remained important. According to his account, the open ground was never the destination. It was a marker. The real significance of the balds was not what stood on top of them, but what his ancestors believed existed beneath them. That idea became the foundation for a tradition carried through generations, one that described the mountains not as empty wilderness, but as places where the visible landscape and the unseen world were believed to meet. Whether someone someone accepts that tradition or regards it as folklore, it introduces a remarkable shift in perspective. Instead of asking why the trees never returned, the elder believed the more important question was why his ancestors wanted those places to remain visible in the first place. To understand that answer, we have to leave the grassy summits for a moment and look beneath the mountains themselves, where Cherokee tradition speaks of another world hidden beyond ordinary sight. To understand why the elder believed the balds had to remain open, we first have to step away from modern maps and enter the world the Cherokee described long before these mountains were surveyed. In that world, the mountains were never empty. They were alive with places that most people would never see, and with communities that, according to Cherokee tradition, existed alongside ordinary human life without belonging to it. The elder did not present these stories as entertainment or as myths invented to explain the landscape. He spoke of them as traditions that had been carried through his family for generations. Traditions that older Cherokee regarded as part of the mountains themselves. One of the oldest traditions concerns a people known as the Nunnehi. Ethnographers who spent years recording Cherokee oral traditions described the Nunnehi as beings who looked much like ordinary people but lived apart from them. They were not portrayed as ghosts wandering the forests, nor were they worshipped as gods. Instead, they were remembered as hidden inhabitants of the mountains whose homes lay inside the ridges rather than upon them. According to these accounts, travelers caught in violent storms or hunters who became lost in the wilderness were sometimes said to have found shelter with the Nunnehi, only realizing much later that they had entered a place few people were ever meant to see. The elder believed those traditions mattered because they all shared one unusual detail. They did not describe hidden villages buried beneath random hills or scattered through the valleys. Again and again, the entrances were connected to the highest parts of the mountains. The same mountain balds that outsiders admired for their views appeared repeatedly in Cherokee stories as places where another world could supposedly be reached. According to the elder, that repetition was not accidental. He believed his ancestors were deliberately connecting the open summits with something beneath the mountains that later generations gradually stopped understanding. The elder also spoke of another group remembered in Cherokee tradition. These were often referred to as the little people. Unlike the Nunnehi, they were described as smaller in stature and closely associated with caves, rock shelters, and hidden places beneath the earth. In many traditional accounts, they were not portrayed as enemies. They could be helpful when treated with respect and left undisturbed. Yet the stories almost always included the same warning. Certain places belonged to them. Those places were not meant to be entered carelessly. The elder explained that older Cherokee never separated these stories from the landscape itself. A cave was not simply a cave. A rocky opening in the side of a mountain was not always considered an empty passage. Some locations carried a history that people were expected to respect, whether they fully understood it or not. At first glance, these traditions may seem unrelated to the mountain balds. One speaks of grassy summits, the other speaks of hidden places beneath the mountains. But according to the elder, the two were inseparable. He believed the balds were important because they marked the locations where those hidden places were believed to exist. The open ground was never the destination. It was simply the landmark that remained visible from one generation to the next, ensuring that people never forgot where certain traditions were rooted. One detail especially captured his attention. Folklore usually changes as it passes from one generation to another. Names evolve, locations shift, stories grow or lose details over time. Yet in the traditions the elder referred to, one image appeared again and again. A doorway in the mountain, a passage leading downward, an entrance hidden within the rock. Whether those descriptions reflected symbolic storytelling or memories of actual places is impossible to determine today. But the elder believed that the consistency of the image mattered. Different families could remember different parts of a tradition, yet they continued returning to the same idea. Somewhere beneath the high ridges were entrances that were not meant to be forgotten. That is where his account begins to move beyond traditional folklore, because according to the elder, not everything beneath the mountains was remembered as friendly. He believed the Nunnehi were only one part of a much older story. The real reason the balds remained open, he said, had nothing to do with protecting what lived below. It had everything to do with watching what might one day come back out. Everything we've covered so far leads to one question. If the Cherokee traditions remembered hidden places beneath these mountains, why did the stories place so much importance on the open summits above them? According to the elder's account preserved in the source, the answer was surprisingly practical. He believed the balds were never created so people could admire the view. They existed because the people who came before him wanted an unobstructed view of the mountain itself. In his telling, the purpose of the open ground was not to look outward across the valleys. It was to make sure nothing could remain hidden beneath the trees if it ever emerged from the mountain. That idea becomes easier to understand when another old Cherokee tradition name is placed beside it. Among the oldest stories of the southern Appalachians is the account of a dangerous creature that lived high in the mountains. Different versions describe it differently, but the source explains that it was remembered as something that carried people away to a cave hidden within the mountainside. The challenge was never defeating the creature. The challenge was finding where it disappeared. As long as the forest concealed the mountains, its refuge remained hidden. According to the tradition described by the elder, people eventually cleared the highest ground so they could watch the ridges continuously and trace the creature back to its entrance before sealing it. Whether someone accepts that story as literal history or as symbolic tradition, one feature stands out. The solution wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a battle. It wasn't even the creature itself. The focus of the story is the landscape. The mountaintops were deliberately altered because visibility mattered more than anything else. In the elder's telling, the important part was never the monster. It was the entrance. Everything else in the story revolves around preventing that entrance from disappearing beneath the forest. That is exactly where his interpretation begins to differ from the way most people read Cherokee folklore today. Many modern readers see these accounts as independent legends collected over different generations. The elder believed they described different pieces of the same tradition. The Nunahai living inside the mountains, the little people guarding hidden places, the warnings attached to certain balds, the story of an entrance that had to remain visible. He saw them as connected rather than separate. In his family's understanding, each tradition pointed toward the same conclusion. There were places beneath the mountains that people deliberately remembered, and the balds existed so those places would never be lost. One detail in particular stayed with those who later repeated his account. He said the mountaintops were never being watched because anyone expected something to happen every day. They were watched because forgetting was considered more dangerous than waiting. Once the forest covered the landmarks, later generations would no longer know where the important places had been. According to the elder, that was the real danger, not that something beneath the mountain would suddenly appear, but that the knowledge of where to look would disappear first. At this point, the story remains entirely within Cherokee oral tradition. There are no government surveys confirming hidden entrances beneath the balds. There are no archaeological reports identifying underground structures beneath those summits. Everything we've discussed so far belongs to the traditions carried by Cherokee families and preserved in the account we're examining. That distinction is important because it allows us to separate what the elder believed from what can be documented historically. And that is where the story takes another unexpected turn, because according to the same source, the elder claimed that during the late 19th century, survey crews working in the Smoky Mountains may have encountered something beneath one of the balds that reminded him of those older traditions. Whether that account belongs to history or to memory is the question we'll examine next. Up to this point, the story belongs entirely to Cherokee tradition. The elder was describing beliefs that had been carried through his family, not discoveries published in archaeological journals. That distinction matters because oral tradition and historical documentation are not the same thing. One preserves memory, the other preserves evidence. Sometimes they overlap. Often they do not. According to the account preserved in the source, the elder believed there was one moment when those two worlds briefly touched. He pointed to the late 19th century when survey crews began moving through the southern Appalachians, measuring ridges, mapping watersheds, and recording features that would eventually appear on government maps. These expeditions weren't searching for ancient structures. Their job was far more ordinary. They were documenting the landscape as the region became better known to engineers, foresters, and government officials. The elder claimed that one of those crews, working near what many people later associated with Gregory Bald, encountered something they had never expected to find. According to his account, the discovery wasn't on the surface. It was beneath it. He said the crew reached worked stone rather than ordinary bedrock, not loose rock scattered by erosion, but stone that appeared deliberately shaped and fitted together. Behind that stone, he claimed, was an opening leading downward into the mountain. The surveyors reportedly lowered measuring lines into the shaft, but according to the elder, they were unable to determine how deep it extended. They recorded measurements, prepared notes, and forwarded their observations through official channels. Then, according to the tradition, the story simply disappeared from the public record. It is important to pause here. The source presents this as the elder's account. It does not provide surviving government reports confirming that such a shaft was documented, and it does not cite an archaeological excavation proving the claim. What survives is the tradition itself, passed down through the elder and preserved in the account we're examining today. That distinction is essential if we're going to treat the story honestly. Even so, the elder believed the disappearance of those records mattered. He argued that the survey crew had not uncovered an abandoned mine or an ordinary cave. In his family's tradition, they had reached something intentionally sealed long before the 19th century. The worked stone, he said, was never meant to be the discovery itself. It was meant to prevent anyone from going farther. That idea echoed something his ancestors had repeated for generations. The balds were not important because of what stood on top of them. They were important because of what they marked below. According to the elder, the open summits, the stories of hidden doorways, and the warnings attached to certain mountains were all parts of the same inherited understanding. The survey crew, in his view, had unknowingly arrived at one of the very places those traditions were trying to preserve. The elder also connected his account to a broader pattern he believed existed throughout the eastern United States. He pointed out that many 19th century excavations produced reports that later became difficult to trace. While local newspapers occasionally described discoveries that never appeared in later official summaries, historians have offered many explanations for why 19th century documentation can be incomplete. Lost records, changing institutions, inconsistent cataloguing, and the ordinary disorder of the period. The elder looked at the same gaps and reached a different conclusion. He believed some discoveries had simply been allowed to fade from public attention because they did not fit the accepted understanding of the past. Whether one agrees with that interpretation or not, the elder's argument rested on a single idea that never changed throughout his account. He said the stone beneath the bald was not an entrance waiting to be explored. It was a seal that earlier generations had deliberately placed there, and according to him, the people who placed it had left something else behind as well. Not an inscription, not a monument, a responsibility. They believed someone always needed to remember where those places were, because one day others might forget. That final idea leads directly to the closing part of this investigation, because after telling the story of the balds, the hidden passages, and the old survey, the elder left one warning that his family said he repeated until the end of his life. Whether the elder's account reflects history, symbolism, or a tradition shaped across generations is something each viewer will have to decide for themselves. What we do know is that the mountain balds are real. They have puzzled researchers for generations, and even today there is no single explanation that fully accounts for every one of them. Alongside that unanswered scientific question exists another record, one preserved not in geological surveys, but in Cherokee oral tradition. The elder believed those two stories pointed toward the same places while offering very different explanations for why they mattered. Perhaps the balds are simply one of nature's rarest landscapes. Perhaps the tradition surrounding them grew from centuries of people trying to understand an unusual feature of the mountains. Or perhaps, as the elder believed, some landscapes were remembered because they carried meanings that later generations slowly forgot. Whatever the answer may be, one thing is difficult to ignore. Long before anyone debated climate, fire, or grazing animals, Cherokee families had already attached these summits to stories that survived for generations. Whether those stories preserve history, belief, or both, they remain part of the cultural memory of the Smoky Mountains and deserve to be understood in that context. The next time you stand on one of those quiet, grassy summits looking out across an endless sea of forest, you may still see nothing more than an unusually beautiful mountain. Or you may find yourself asking the same question that has lingered over these ridges for generations. Why are these places still here? Exactly as they have always been.